morning, everyone, Scott included. Today, as you know, we're finishing off our breakfast briefing series, which has run since probably last May, I guess, with Kath McCarthy speaking on managing workplace conflict, which comes within the area of practice management business skills. There's a small profile of Kath in the handout material, but what I would like to say, in addition to what is there, Kath is a former, well, she is a lawyer, I guess, still. She was a partner at Wisewells and she was an executive at WorkSafe Victoria. She's also a qualified psychologist, and as you'll read there, it's her psychology qualification that she uses to in her business now as a facilitator, coach, etc. But my endorsement of Kath is simply that she works with about 40 members of our list in their practice development. And her and another guy, Mark Raymond, a business development person, have been a great assistance to our barristers. So if business coaching or practice development is an issue for any of you, I would highly recommend Kath and Mark Raymond. Please welcome Kath McCarthy.
Thank you. I'm conscious I'm speaking to a room of experts. So I get to count myself one because I'm a lawyer trained as well, so I suppose I share that expertise. And so while I think that's worth acknowledging, I think sometimes as lawyers we forget the limitations of our expertise, and that the tools we have to resolve conflict are particular tools, important tools, necessary but not sufficient to resolve all the conflict that you'd encounter in the workplace. There is a place for adversarial interventions and there's a place for mediation, which I think of as a step before the adversarial process, but there are 10 steps before that where there's early intervention, early spotting, ways of interacting with those signs of tension that can convert conflict into something much more productive than what you might be dealing with on a daily basis, where positions are entrenched, when emotion might be high, and where the processes and training of law is your best friend. I want to talk today about much earlier stages of tension, of warning signs, of things you can do to prevent things escalating into the sort of matters you might be coming across in your practice, without diminishing the importance of that expertise. So, the first point I want to talk about is where conflict can manifest. This is in some ways obvious beyond words, but often forgotten. That one of the starting points of conflict is manifesting within the person. It's an internal experience and initially often invisible to the outside world. There's an internal conflict, might be felt as tension, might be felt as inner churn, might be felt as full irritation. These might be difficult to spot, although not impossible. The sort of things that would fall into the inner conflict category would be things like, this is a current inner conflict of mine, I want to be healthy and go to the gym, and yet I really want to have a red wine tonight. It's a momentary churn. All the way to, I want to be seen as an expert professional, and yet I also want to do this enormous workload and work in this place, and the two seem to be in conflict with each other because how do I manage my workload? It's overwhelming. It's an inner churn there, inner conflict. That then often bubbles into the interpersonal. So this can be where conflict arises between two people, and sometimes the person who's on the receiving end of conflict doesn't know where it's come from. It's sometimes just projected onto them, but then they enter into this dance of reaction, of stimulus response, where each presses each other's buttons. So this can be in the form of mild irritation all the way to the sort of conflicts you'd be seeing in your workplaces with your clients. Goes without saying. Intra-group, I see this in my work often around a boardroom table, perhaps among partners for some reason, where the group are in some form of disagreement over an issue. Now, in some ways you could see this as a series of bilateral conflicts between lots of individuals, but if it's broken down to that level, and while it might be tempting to deal with it at that level, something's missed in terms of the complexity of the relationships. There's something happening at a group level that's separate from all the individual relationships. Real complexity there. An intra-group. So you'd see this between practice areas potentially, where one practice area's priorities or goals might not seem to be consistent with the others, and healthy competition turns into something a little bit more destructive. You can see it within different groups of the firms. If you're from larger firms, which might have different departments, even from IT and HR, from finance and HR, when there's just seems to be an us and them mentality developing. So I think of this as inter-group conflict. The thing is that when you're dealing with workplace conflict, you might start at one of these levels, but usually it involves more than one. And yet if you deal with the conflict and remain at the level that first presents, you might be missing important data that you need to feed into the solution. In solving an interpersonal conflict and not addressing the intrapersonal one, it might just bubble out and attack something else or someone else. Similarly, if you ignore an intrapersonal conflict, so within the person, then you might find, or you're dealing with that, you might find that it bubbles out into an intragroup level and plays out on a different level. So to be aware of the complexity when you're tackling the sort of conflicts that we'll be talking about today. Excuse my croaky voice. So I want to give you a few metaphors. I like image metaphors because they'll stick with you more than words. And one of them, thanks Michael, one of them is the idea of an iceberg. So when you see the conflict, you've named it as that and you've identified it as that, whether you call it tension, conflict or dispute, you see it, it's visible, to think that there is something often going on beneath awareness, below the waterline. Just like an iceberg, what's underneath is a lot bigger and sometimes more unknown than what everyone is visibly experiencing. So if you can keep that image in your mind, it will assist you already, because you'll exercise a bit more curiosity than dealing with what first presents. So today, the first picture today, I want to pull apart some of the stuff that often sits beneath the waterline. The sources of conflict and the early warning signs of those sources. So these things. This is not an exhaustive list, but when I go into organisations, this is what is often happening in the background. Things like this are ripe for conflict. First one, change. Change, I often deal with the leaders who say people resist change, and I always dispute that. It's not that people resist change. What they resist is loss. We're loss averse. So when you hear about a change, happening, we do a micro assessment and we say, is it a loss or is it a gain? If we're not sure, we often default into a protective mechanism and say loss. There's a loss there, and that's what we resist. So if it's assessed as a loss, and if that's what the change represents, people have already started to go into protective mode. For some reason, that sends the antenna up for conflict. If you think about it, it starts interpersonal. People have intrapersonal. They're already starting to be a bit gutty, a bit unsure, a bit nervous. And with that frame, they walk into interpersonal relationships and then things fire off. And yet the source of it goes right back to initial assessment that there's a loss in what you've just said to me and I don't like it. So change, if there's change within your organisation, it's a time to be on the lookout for the early warning signs of conflict. Expectations, and I could put there as assumptions as well. We have this default way of thinking sometimes that people should just be able to read our minds and know that what we expect, even if we don't know we expect it, is clearly understood. And we never make explicit what's implicit, but we walk through life with a whole series of expectations that we just assume are shared. So what does a good letter of advice look like? How quickly should you turn around that brief? What does soon mean? What does I'll get back to you in a minute mean? And yet we throw these words around and assume that the expectation has been clearly communicated. And unless people are quite skilled at communicating around those expectations and deliberately make effort to make these expectations explicit, often that's where conflict starts. So how are the expectations within the workplace being communicated to each other and at all levels and to your major service providers? And it's these sort of things, if done poorly, can be the early warning signs or early warning stimuli of conflict. So go back and do an audit of how that's going in firms. Personalities is a massive one, and this is familiar to many people, that people have different personalities and that sometimes these clash. Sometimes these clashes are very obvious. But let's think of one that we all are familiar with, the idea of an extrovert-introvert. Is that a familiar term to people? So introvert is someone who gets their energy, and when they're tired they might look internally to re-energise themselves, and so what they really like when they're stressed is often the door shut, get down and do their work, and a bit of quiet time. Put them together with an extreme extrovert who gets their energy and helps clarify their thinking by having really loud conversations with other people. Put them together in the workplace and see how those two personalities clash and potentially form conflict. The extrovert bowls into the office wanting to talk about the day. It's Friday night and you want to go home and it's not helping. And then the extrovert says, "Why aren't you talking to me? You don't like me," and off you go. So how do those personalities fit in the workplaces you come from? Role conflicts is also a big one that I look out for. What happens with roles that naturally put two people into conflict that might not otherwise enter that space? That's what I mean by that. The goals of one role might be different at one level from the goals of another. I often see this around money. So if one person sees their role as perhaps saving money and the other person sees their role as potentially having to spend money, then this seems to cause conflict in firms. So perhaps in the world of business development, I have to build my business, my role is to build business, and perhaps another partner is keeping an idea on profitability. And so those two roles, as they're currently understood, if not really talked about, could lead to role conflict. Those two roles. One person thinks they need to spend it in order to do their job, and the other person thinks they need to preserve it in order to do their job. Really, there's a solution there, but sometimes you never get to the level of the solution, you just conflict about it. Power is a big one, another one that's often present but unspoken about. Power is always being assessed. Power is not just positional power, like in firms, who's the partner, at the bar, who's the QC and the junior. Positional power. Power is also based on information, who knows what and who's willing to share it. It's based on expertise, who knows about this case or who has that, who knows about the case, who knows about the area of law. And there's power in that subject matter expertise, and that can be shared or it can be withheld. The use of power and the awareness of your individual sources of power, if not brought to the surface, can be held back or pushed forward inappropriately. And I often find the use of power that's not done well, overused or underused, can lead to misunderstandings and conflict. There's a really interesting experiment with rats, which I won't go into because it's pretty horrendous, but it demonstrated that if resources are inadequate, so if you put too many rats together in a very small space, they tend to get hungry in a way that we don't want to think about, and they might behave towards each other in a much more aggressive way than if they have a very large space. So what psychs have done from that is extrapolated that to say, well, at times when there's a scarcity of resources, it increases competition and it can bring out behaviours that you might not otherwise see. If people feel they have to perform or survive, survive or perform without enough resources to do it, they might look to their peers and say, well, I have to beat you in order to succeed for me. And if there's enough resources, that dynamic doesn't enter in. So if that's what's going on in the workplace and there's a sense of, I don't have what I need to do my job, you might find that people can't help but look towards their peers in a more aggressive way than is going to be useful. So how are resources being shared and how are resources being understood? Remember, that's often about perception, not reality as well. So how are people feeling and perceiving the level of resources they have? And that is secretarial support, IT support, money. There's lots of ways that resources are assessed in firms. Priorities is a similar one to expectations. What's important to me might not be important to you. So think of the relationship between a barrister and a solicitor. Sometimes I see conflict there where a barrister has submissions to prepare tomorrow and the solicitor has a statement of claim they want drafted last night, and there's not the quick enough turnaround from the solicitor's point of view, and the barrister is thinking that the solicitor's being unrealistic, that there's no particular urgency with the turnaround of that statement of claim. Those priorities are both reasonable from where the other person sits, but they're not often spoken about or negotiated. People just assume that the priorities they set are understood by the person they're interacting with. Can be sources of conflict that's easily resolved. So, source of conflict, one way of thinking what's below the waterline. If you go even deeper than that, underneath all those sources of conflict are much more rigorous psychological processes, that there is some sort of sense that, are my needs being met? I have needs, whether they're personality-based needs or goal-based needs, or a need for power, or a need for autonomy, or a need for control, or a need for certainty, that I feel that you, or this circumstance, is holding back from me. But often we just feel something in the space of conflict and never lower the waterline to identify the need that we feel is threatened in that circumstance. So needs and unmet needs, an assessment of unmet needs is often the next level. Beneath even all those little sources of conflict, there's a need in that. What is it? What is the need that feels like it's not being met and has led to the tension internally or between two people? Another one is identity, of how do you want to be seen? This is related to need, perhaps has a bit more of a cognitive element to it. I want to be seen as a lawyer. I want to be seen as an expert. I want to be seen as a professional, and something in the way that this situation is unfolding or in the way you're treating me is challenging that identity I hold of myself. So that identity need can be at play in workplaces and values. Values can be personal, of I value honesty and I value integrity, but sometimes values can be shared even generationally. And if you've heard the work around millennials and Gen X, that the values of different generations sometimes can feel like they're in conflict. So what are the values shared by even layers within the firm? What are the values that are different within members of the firm or groups within the firm? Can give rise to conflict. When we feel threatened, things happen internally. These days there's a lot more literacy around brain science. I'm always a little bit cautious about getting into neuroscience. As much as we know a lot more about it, it's much more complex than people generally think. So I'd invite you to think about the sort of thing I'm going to go through now as a metaphor rather than a 10-second lecture in neuroscience. The idea is, and we know this from fRMI studies, which means we don't need to lay someone on a slab and any longer just scan them. We can put things on their heads and measure them while they're interacting in the world. So we know a lot more about the way the brain functions when we interact with other people and engage in tasks. And one thing we're learning a lot more about is that When we're feeling threatened, our identity, our needs, our values, those sort of threats are responded to in the brain in a similar way to survival threats. So we can get an amygdala level response. Is this familiar to people? The fight, flight, freeze response. I always check that because a lot of people seem to be quite familiar with this these days. Now, while we're not being hunted by saber-toothed tigers, I don't know whether we were ever hunted by saber-tooths, but while the things that we're grappling with and talking about today is not life-threatening, sometimes our brain's not particularly good at distinguishing between a threat to a need and a life-threatening moment, and it responds in a similar way. It doesn't have the repertoire of responses. So you get this fight-flight response. When that happens, when that fight-flight response takes over and the cortisol gets very high in our system, it's a lot harder for our brain to work and access the part of itself that engages with thinking and with reading people's social cues and with planning and with logic, which might be why sometimes the training and tools of lawyering don't always serve you when you're in the middle of conflict. Because if you think about what you are trained to do as a lawyer is inherently a process of logic and reason and standing back from and using hindsight. It's a thinking process. In the heat of the moment, people are not open to thinking in the way that would be useful. And sometimes we're not either. It's more of an emotional experience. And that part of the brain closes off. So when you're seeing workplace conflict, I think it's sometimes useful, and you're getting frustrated, they're not being reasonable. Sometimes it can be useful to give a bit of space between the frustration you might feel and the effective response to that situation, to think about what might be happening at a brain level and think, hang on, they might not just be able to, at this moment, to engage in logic and to be reading the social cues. At the moment, they're in a threat alert or threat response state. I just need to give them some time. They've closed off that part of their brain, which again, think of as a metaphor. And what happens when we close off, we tend to, it's another metaphor I want to leave you with, or an image, think of it through glasses. Some bits of our experience become very clear to us. So we get sharp focus on some bits of our experience, some aspects of reality, but in doing that we get a distorted view, that we lose focus of other areas. So what happens when we're feeling threat alert, so precursor to conflict? We think about how I feel becomes very clear, or how I don't want to feel. It's a large fixation on that. What do I want? This is what I want, or what I don't want becomes a point of fixation and very clear. This is what I need, not what you need. And so what is being lost in that clarity that's being brought to these things are what are the consequences of my behaviour? It's often not front of mind. What will happen if I continue on this path? Or how am I impacting other people? It's often a bit not that important in that moment. That's not where the focus is. Or, in particular, how do you feel? I don't really care at the moment. Some of the work I do before things get too hot and oppositional, as in people have their positions, is help people see the things that they'd otherwise miss in their fixation. Just expand the data that they're responding to before the conflict becomes too entrenched and too far, where that process of raising or lowering their own waterline is a lot more elusive, because people are very strongly fixated. So to get in early and help people see things a little bit more broadly than they are naturally taking themselves to. So the idea of this is peeling back the onion, not cutting through, peeling back. If you cut through an onion, it desiccates really fast. There's a violence to it. But if you peel it back slowly, you can move with things like, well, what's your position? And this is mainstream for, if you've done any conflict resolution training, position's often the starting place. Remembering positions is what I want. but not to stay with what they want, and to really try and understand, well, what are you interested in? What do you really want? But more importantly, what is it you need? What is the unmet need? Or what is that identity piece going on? Or how are you assessing this in terms of values? To peel back the onion to the real source of the conflict so that they can be aware of it, and you're more likely to find common ground with the person they're in conflict with when you're helping them raise awareness at that level. Does anyone have this belief? Yes. It's amazing though, I think sometimes, as much as intellectually this belief is, we can understand that it's not always right. In our gut, sometimes I think we walk through life with conflict is bad, should be avoided. And to be honest with yourself, it's an important thing to be aware of if that's the case, because it will drive how you respond if you can notice these early warning signs. I think so, question that. This is taken from some research on organisational effectiveness, where you look at outcomes. So I don't want to spend a lot of time on this, but I suppose it's a challenge to the view that all conflict is bad, that there is a Goldilocks space where conflict is there, there's enough tension to be creative, there's enough tension to avoid groupthink, there's enough tension and discussions about expectations where you're bringing them to the surface and checking in with them. But when it gets too hot or too oppositional, the positions are too far apart, it can become destructive. And so the skill in managing workplace conflict is trying to find the Goldilocks space of enough tension to get great outcomes, but not too much so that the communication is impaired or it is destructive. So when you're looking at workplace conflict, I'd encourage you to think about it on that spectrum of where the conflict you're tuning into, where would you put it on the spectrum? How would you describe it? Destructive conflict, if you're going to give it that sort of a name, so looking at the impact of it. Destructive conflict begins to distract you from outcomes. It begins to distract you from undermining effectiveness, undermining confidence, undermining relationships, putting people further apart than when they started. So you're not bringing people together, or you're putting positions further apart. Leading to harm. And harm is not just the sort of harm, it can be to psychological harm, but it's also unprofessional conduct or lower standards. So it can harm the reputation of the firm, it can harm the practice, it can harm a client, sort of this out-of-body experience. When it is constructive, so in that Goldilocks space, it can be very clarifying, it can help solve problems that people didn't even know were there, it just has been a butting point. It actually builds trust. I was listening to a Radio National article podcast, and there was someone who said, don't ever waste a crisis. So I was talking about professional services. When you really stuff up with a client, don't run away from it. This is an opportunity to show how great you are when things go wrong, and it can really build trust because it's being tested. So to use the conflict as an opportunity to show how honest and authentic and effective you can be when what's happened has tipped over into that sort of space. Releasing tension can be just great to let it all out, catharsis, and it can help you understand better things that you weren't even aware of. I just want to pause there if there are any questions, but I always do this in these lectures because attention spans these days are 9 minutes. We've been going for at least...
Not for us lawyers.
No, that's why I've been going longer, 9 minutes. So I just want to give you a chance to have a chat to the person next to you. This is called a 3-minute pause, which we often do. Chat to the person next to you or just collect your thoughts, but what are you hearing, and if there are any questions at that point before we go into the how to become constructive. So 3 minutes. So are there any questions or comments at this point?
I did want to ask just something, how the overuse or underuse of power
causes conflict and what can be done to resolve that?
Power is really interesting because I think some people think of my question before, power is bad. It's some things people walk around with, just like conflict is bad, power is bad. And when you have that belief, there's a real risk you'll underuse your power. So where I see that manifesting is when someone is, say, appointed to partnership and they want to be your friend still. And how do they move from peer to leader? Not embracing the power that comes and is a necessary part of that new position. So I often see that in early promotions when someone is taking on a new role, or perhaps moving up within a partnership into a different type of role, they'll underuse their power and sort of just get that interaction wrong because someone needs them to be acting in that position. They need to be embracing their positional authority in order to manage that interaction in a way that doesn't give rise to conflict, because the person interacting with them, they're actually not interacting with them as a person in that moment. They're wanting something from that position. And that's what I mean by underusing power. Similarly, say information. If you have information and you're in a meeting and you don't share it and don't own the power of that information, it can be irritating, but it also can be destructive because decisions are made without that information being shared. So the power is underused, or perhaps it's withheld intentionally, in which it's overused. So where was the intention? So then you're withholding information in order to retain the power of the information you hold. And so again, there's something missing out in the decision making, which then leads to conflict. So does that help explain it? Yeah. Any other questions? Okay, moving on. So the how-tos. The how-tos. It's actually interesting. I'm going to share what you were talking about, Michael. He said don't do this, but I'm going to. This idea that, well, this is a theory I'll put out to you and just see if you agree with me, that a lot of the time, I think, when we're trying to bring control to your desks and organise your offices, that there's a sense that what we're trying to do is bring order to chaos, to feel in control, and yet in lowering the waterline, so bringing things out into the open, whether it's a cause of a conflict, is actually increasing chaos a little bit. You're increasing the complexity. You're tuning into information that will be useful but are kind of uncomfortable. So it's often the practice of law, and I share this, is that a lot of time we spent corralling chaos and scaffolding it up. So in some ways, exercising skills of managing conflict is sort of asking to go against that instinct. Is that fair, Michael? Is that what we're talking about? No. Okay. So things to look out for. If you go back to your firms today, what kind of things could you tune into, this is before you start lowering waterlines, might be a signal that there might be something there. Before there's any visible conflict, there could be something bubbling. These are things very, very easy to ignore. Just noticing them, you might not need to intervene, but noticing them opens options for you. Meetings. Meetings are a really rich data source. You're bringing people together into a small space. Think about the rats. Don't think about the rats. You're bringing people together into a small space and you're asking them to interact, usually around an agenda, and talk about things they might not naturally otherwise talk about. That's what effective meetings are. A lot of the time, meetings don't go well. And sometimes that, if you're curious about that and noticing it, sometimes that is a signal that there might be tension bubbling. So noticing someone's dominating that meeting, someone's always talking. What's going on within each person that's causing them not to participate in an equal way? Sometimes meetings are taking place, there's a lot of, these days, iPhones, and people have checked out, they're present but not. What's going on for them? What's happening there that's not leading them to be engaged? Sometimes they're just really boring. They're just boring and people are just going through the motions. A vibrant meeting where there's a lot of discussion is closer to that Goldilocks space. I think meetings are often that place where conflict's avoided, or it's in the other end of the goal. It's nothing's happening or too much is happening by one person. So tune into the meetings, watch them, who's there, what's happening, and take not just a content focus, but sit above the content and watch what's going on at the interpersonal level. Who sits where, who says what, who doesn't, what are the behaviours, and to be noticing that. Displays of anger, even if not directed at someone, easily ignored, but worth tuning into, particularly if the display of anger is disproportionate to what's going on. Because it's a sign there might be some inner churn or an interpersonal issue that might be focusing on an issue between the two people, but lower the waterline, there's something real there that just hasn't found a way to be brought to the surface. So anger and any extreme emotion, particularly disproportionate ones, are signals. Drops in productivity, I think this is known to many people to be tuning into this. People just not at their, spinning along at their best. Easy to ignore, possible to ignore, but worth noticing. So if you don't notice it, how do you strategically decide whether to strategically ignore it or to intervene with it? Turnover, people leaving, we know this. Absenteeism, a more hidden one is presenteeism. People turn up but are not engaged. They're there but not doing much. Gossiping. If you find there are moments of gossip and a close one, which I'll put there, cliques, and there's an us and thems forming in the firm, people disappearing off for lunches or coffees. There's just some, to be seeing that as a way of people trying to cope with stress. Remember, stress is a form of inner conflict often, or be coping with dynamics that they just haven't found a way to constructively deal with. Just noticing these things. How many cliques are there? What kind of gossip's going on? Gossip is a mechanism to build a tend and befriend instinct sometimes, which is another fight, flight, freeze, or tend and befriend, particularly among women. There's a female urge towards forming bonds in times of stress among monkeys and primates, but I think we're not that far removed either. So just to be watching out for these things. Disrespectful, another form of disproportionate. If someone's being disrespectful, strong language. Rule breaking. People who don't normally break the rules suddenly start doing it. Can be a sign of passive-aggressive responses, suddenly breaking rules. What's going on there? So I'm encouraging you to exercise curiosity. Notice and be curious. Not judgmental, but curious, so that you can be strategic in your response. How to respond? This can work. It can work. I think it's a default response a lot of the time. And sometimes the elephant does just wander away. So it is a strategic, effective response. But what we know from this metaphor is that usually, one, it's pretty silly because there's an elephant in the room and you're all pretending it's not there. So it can cause its own trouble. Or he stays around and you go on and the major problem is never really dealt with. It's another way of thinking about lowering the waterline, naming the elephant, finding a way to help him leave the room. So, the ways that we respond. Ignoring the elephant in the room is an avoidance response. Okay? You're avoiding the problem. It's okay, it can be strategic, can be useful, but not always. This is a model that has been around since the 60s and has been developed, began in the 70s. It's very old, but it's still taught at Melbourne Business School today. So it's got longevity. There's a bit of confidence in it as a useful model. The idea that sometimes we're so focused on, or there's a dichotomy of our attention. Sometimes we focus on results and sometimes we focus on people. Sometimes personalities or particular people have an orientation that's habitual in one direction. So I know for me, when I was doing leadership work in firms, I was very probably focused on the y-axis, on people. It was very important to me. And these can influence how you respond to the conflict I've just encouraged you to observe. So if you are interested or avoiding the conflict, chances are you've lost focus on both results and people. What you focus on is how much you want to avoid the conflict and not have to deal with the discomfort of it. When really the result, if you're honest with yourself, the result and the relationships would benefit from a different response. So it doesn't go away, so it's going to get in the way. If, however, you're very focused on results and not sufficiently focused on people, you can get into this competitive, I must win mentality. I must win. So it's very adversarial, probably the fight version of fight-flight, and it's competing. My interests must dominate and I'll walk away feeling like I've won, and that's a successfully resolved conflict because the results have been achieved, whether it's organisational results or what's important to me. We've seen that before, and sometimes you can slip into that. In some ways, a legal training encourages that. Is that fair to say? For your clients, you are focused on results. The opposition are the people that really shouldn't enter too much into it. Too concerned with people, the response is this accommodating response, where I will give ground in order for your interest to come before mine because the relationship is more important than a great result. So the relationship is given too much priority. Compromising is everyone gives ground, typical negotiation, it's okay. The most effective and richest Goldilocks space is found when both priority is given to people and results, where there's a sense of win-win. And it takes a while. It takes energy, it takes engagement, it takes discomfort, it takes time, but the result is often more sustaining. The Thomas Kilmann model, which is a management model, is very similar to the results and people orientation, but it talks about the behaviour around assertiveness and cooperation. So if you have encountered that before, you might have seen those sort of words used with these sort of labels. If you're very assertive in your personality and your behaviours, then you might find competing type responses to conflict. If you're very cooperative, you might find more the accommodating. To be successful in reaching that collaborating response to conflict needs a capacity to find both cooperation and assertiveness. And assertiveness skills in particular, of stating the need without necessarily diminishing the other person or yourself in the process. So you've got this in your pack, although the writing will be very hard to read, but this is just a way of looking at the pros and cons in some way of the different responses, because all the responses can be strategically appropriate. So if you think of that list of objectives, the objective might be an appropriate one. Competing, it might be appropriate to get your own way in the circumstances. And I think, again, of the role of a lawyer, it's completely appropriate sometimes to approach a conflict through a competitive mindset. That's what you're paid to do. Avoiding can also be useful. Avoid having to deal with it. Can have an appropriate strategic response because the elephant does wander away. Sometimes it's useful to be accommodating. Sometimes it's useful to be compromising. So that objective is sound. But when I think the rationale, if that's a rationale behind the exercise of that third column, if the rationale is based on a real belief, that's a belief that you hold, then perhaps that would be your default way of operating and you won't be open to the other methods. So if you look down that list of rationales, which one resonates most strongly with you might give you a sense of what one you would tend to default with. I recognise myself in that accommodating rationale, and I've had to exercise skills in other ways of responding to conflict, but they will probably always be skill-based responses, not personality-based responses. So you might recognise yourself in that list as well, in the third column. It's just good to know what your response will be, or what the response is of the person you're trying to help in the conflict situation. They might enter into it with a similar rationale. And I encourage you to think about these responses as not good or bad, but there's risks associated with them. And the fourth column are those sort of risks that can be carried with the response. So if you take a highly competitive response, then you can feel great because you win, but there can be some casualties on the way. That's the risk. People walk away feeling like they lost. You won, I lost. Is that going to be helpful? If avoidance is an appropriate response and the elephant does wander away, the risk is it doesn't, and there's a festering. That's the risk that's being carried in that strategic response. Accommodating, when you give ground to the other person, they feel great, but over time you might get pretty irritated that your needs are important and haven't been met. It can have a slow build, an inner churn from that. Compromising, it can be very fast, but not a great outcome. So there's an efficiency there in the short term, but sometimes there's some things beneath the waterline that needed to be raised to the surface in order to have a sustained solution or the best solution. And in rushing to a compromise, while there's initial short-term peace, the problem has not been solved at a deep enough level. So you may have missed an opportunity of bringing to the surface something that's going to stop a problem happening in 2 years' time. So collaborating is seen as a major risk, really, when engaged with this time and energy. And there's a risk in that. Sometimes we just don't have the time and energy to respond in a collaborative way. The other way to think about conflict that might assist you in thinking about how to deal with it is, this comes from the family therapy work of Virginia Satir, and think, where is the focus in that moment? You can focus on 4 things. You can focus on yourself, your needs, this is the glasses, what I want, or you can focus on the needs of the other, this is think about what they want and forget yourself in the process, or you can focus on the context and what's happening around, or you can be completely distracted and not focus on any of it. There's different approaches to this as well. So a placating approach is when someone is, this is similar to the accommodating one. I just want you to feel happy. I just want this to be over and for you to walk away happy. That's when your needs are not the focus of your attention. You focus on the other needs. A blaming approach, when it's your fault and there's a high level of aggression, is when the other person's needs are not given priority, instead your needs are in the context. Blaming, this is how I can feel good about myself. I will walk away, and it's akin to the competitive response that we spoke about before. Computing is when there's an analysis of the situation, when there's an assessment of right and wrong, when there are principles applied, when the result is assessed and the right outcome is very clear, which sounds quite attractive to me, which shows you the lawyer training, because that's where context is given priority, and both your needs and the other person's emotional needs are not given much priority at all. It's just about the facts. Distracting, this is my 11-year-old daughter. Let's not talk about nothing at all. Let's not talk about this, Mum, and just very successful distracting from the whole thing. And a levelling approach is like the collaborating one, where all the needs are given equal priority. So there's an awareness of what do you need, what do I need, and what does the context require. Again, it's the idea of the Goldilocks. Okay, tips that will help. So, I've been emphasising early intervention, at least early awareness, even if you choose not to intervene. Early intervention will stop having to escalate. What that early intervention looks like may not involve you at all. So sometimes an early intervention is just a conversation with one of the people in conflict to help them assert themselves, to help them think about what's beneath their own waterline, to help them decide how they're going to approach the situation, and you don't inject yourself into it. And that would be either encouraging them to do their own reflection, or you can support them in the process, which is a more extensive engagement. If you've heard of conflict coaching, you can really engage in a lot of scaffolding around that self-support. And you can do that with both people. You can say, you're going to talk and I'm not going to be in the room. Encouraging one issue at a time, even if you're in the middle of it. There's some work being done by Gottman in family therapy and couples therapy, which is what are the principles of fair fighting. And it's the idea that you can, when you're angry, remember a whole lot of things that you're wounded by. And sometimes that's not particularly helpful. To just focus on one issue and get to the bottom of that is often more productive and all we can manage, particularly when things are hot. And even if they're not hot, to separate the issues out can be helpful. So encouraging one issue at a time. If there's another issue, well, let's deal with that another time. So really trying to isolate and drill down into one issue, and then we'll move on, and then we'll see how that impacts on the next issue. Be quite sequential about it. If you are intervening, the first 3 minutes are really important. Has anyone intervened and actually helped scaffold conversation between two people? Or if you've actually having to intervene yourself into a conflict that you're in the middle of, those opening lines are worth putting a bit of thought into. First 3 minutes, because it's those first 3 minutes in a conversation that's potentially going to be hot. People will make an early assessment of how much they need to protect themselves. And if it starts badly, its chance of it reopening trust can be very difficult. So to go in soft at the beginning, with we're going to be taught lots of idea about the agenda, a conversation about the process, maybe a conversation about what we're trying to achieve, the opening of the argument phase, framing up what's going to happen, what they can expect, what's not going to happen, what's not going to be discussed, how it's going to unfold, rather than going straight into the details. This is familiar to many people these days. I statements, you know what I mean by that? I statements, not you statements. So when there's a complaint, to say what impact it's had on you, rather than say a labelling and blaming communication, which is you did this, you haven't done this. To use statements about the impact on myself or on the context. It's less threatening and less likely, carries less risk of closing down the communication. If you're in the conflict or watching on to the conflict, to be focusing on curiosity above judgment. This is a very fine line because it can look similar, but it's quite important to be thinking about what could be going on rather than walking in with a whole lot of assumptions about what was going on and who was at fault. So even though you might have an idea about what happened and who was at fault and what's beneath the waterline, to go in with lightness about that, think of it as a working hypothesis and then testing it, rather than walking in with a firm judgment that's rigidly held and you're there to prove it, to prove that you're right. So when you're slipping into the lawyering frame of mind, that you're not there to prove a point, you're there to unpeel, open, and you can do it with a hypothesis and a bit of a theory about what might be going on, but leave room for the fact you might be wrong, and that's okay. Even if you're ultimately right, you won't bring people on that journey if you go in with too much judgment. Listening is more important than talking. 80-20. So 80% of the time to be listening would be a good little marker. When you're in a conversation, how much talking did you do if you were intervening to assist a dispute? If you found yourself talking more than listening, that's probably not a great sign, because that's probably a sign you've slipped into sharing your opinion about what's going on. Yeah? Because you've got a pretty good idea, and so it's very close to lecturing and might not be. You might end up with an accommodation response. Okay, I'm going to get out of the room, I'm just going to nod along. But you haven't really helped someone unpack. And the problem, not the person. So you don't have to label someone as lazy or argumentative or an extrovert or an introvert. We're focused on the issue and the problem and the objective behaviour and what impact it's having. So what's occurred and what impact is it having, and why is that a problem, and what do we need to do to ensure it's not a problem? So issues and problems, not people and trying to change people. And this is from anyone who's done a negotiation course would say we're trying to move away from what people want, to what they need. So we're trying to shift away, we're trying to focus on the needs here Even if their initial starting point, their position, and they might be very wedded to it, we're trying to peel back the onion, peel it back to what do they actually need, because there might be ways of meeting that need that hasn't occurred to them, and that's when you're moving into that creative problem-solving space. Often needs are a common ground, because we share the same needs. We share a need for control and competence and autonomy at a fundamental level. So you're more likely to find common ground if you're on that level. If you're involved in facilitating a resolution, the 5-step approach, I don't know why, we like to have numbers, don't we? It's probably 10 steps in the 5 steps, but I'm more likely to remember 5. Okay, the idea of responding, not reacting, so that don't get swept up into the emotion of the room. You're focusing on the issue, not the person. You're not there to take sides. You're helping them focus on the issue, not the person. You're not looking to find out who's at fault. You're wanting to control your own emotions and to be observing. Take an observational, curious and open stance. That's the mindset. Not, I'm going to find out who's wrong and I'm annoyed. So if you're walking into it already annoyed, put it off and come back to it another time. The idea of looking to understand, again, this curiosity, lowering the waterline, looking to understand as many factors as you can you think the conversation can bear. It can be difficult to introduce too much complexity, but a little bit more than the parties walked into the room with will be of assistance. Defining the problem, the next step, after there's a discussion about what's going on, we've lowered the waterline. Okay, in light of that, let's talk about what is the issue. What is the issue we're trying to solve here? What's the impact? Discussing options. We could try this, we could try this. What else could we try, and what else? And what would happen if we did that? And what would happen if we didn't do that? So a real brainstorming, and then just an agreeing on next steps. It's pretty logical, and it's taught in most mediation courses. But you can apply it in a lighter way without necessarily having a mediator hat on. A couple of things about preventing conflict, so that if you have good practices around this, you might avoid some of the sources. If you're in a position of power, step into it. And the power might be even the power over your own expectations. So how clear are you being about what's expected, of what you expect and what you want? So when you say, if you're talking to a barrister, having worked with many of them, I need this brief, I want this brief, be clear of whether want this brief means 24 hours or 5 weeks. They might not know because they've got other things they're trying to balance. What are your expectations? Or check in with what do people expect of you? Effective communication pathways. Is the communication clear, or are you using lots of generalisations? How is communication flowing? Is it shut down or flowing smoothly? To look for as many ways of improving communication as possible. Those sort of basic communication practices. How are they flowing in the firm? Not holding people to account can be a real source of conflict, but it's often a sign that you might be too focused on people and not focused enough on results. So when people don't deliver, what do? Do you just excuse it? Because while that person might be really grateful that you haven't held them to account, their colleague's really irritated. So what's happening around accountability? And you can cause unintended conflict just because you've made a choice to keep the peace with one person while the other person's busting their chops and delivering, not being acknowledged for it, and then their colleague gets away with it. These sort of things can cause, I've seen it over and over again, cause conflict. Talked about power. Know where your sources of power are and decide how to use them. Role clarity of what's in scope, but more importantly, what's out of scope for a role. What do you not have to give your attention to in a role? If you can explain that to every one of the people you work with, it will in itself give role clarity. You don't have to think about this, you don't have to think about that. And more importantly, in some ways, how do the roles interact with each other? Who needs to know what? Who's accountable? Who's responsible? Who needs to be consulted before a decision's made? Who needs to be informed but not consulted after a decision's made? And what's the sequence that you're interacting with each other? What are the goals of that role? What are the priorities of that role? And what are the priorities of the other role? Really making these things explicit. If you don't know the answer to that, chances are there's a role clarity issue already. So find the answers and then communicate them. And this is taken from some work done by the Vic government around how to make conflict resilient workplaces. In some ways it goes without saying, but it's a bit of a checklist and you've got them in the slides. What is the culture? What are the messages you're giving within your organisations about conflict? And you might not use the word conflict, you might use the word diversity. Do we all have to be the same? Or do we really like having difference, and not just cultural and gender diversity, but different opinions? So how do we encourage difference, arguments, without it escalating to conflict? How do they occur, and what do we say about them occurring, and how do we message that? This commitment to being upriver, not adversarial, to being early intervention, early noticing, strategic intervention. Not always early intervention, but make a choice about intervening early as possible before it becomes oppositional. People form their positions and get entrenched. So when things go wrong, a sense of responding quickly, not festering. So avoiding the avoidance response. And if you have procedures, which are good to have, do you even comply with them? Sometimes you lose trust very quickly when you have a procedure. You make an exception and you make another one and you make another one. It's dangerous. Okay. Any questions as we finish? 8:45. I'll be around for another 5 minutes or more, so you feel free to catch me at the end. But that concludes our lecture for today. So thanks for your attention and well done finishing CPD for the year.